Welcome back. Earlier this week, we told you how New Mexico was hosting the second annual Kids Count Conference here in Albuquerque. And as part of that, the Kids Count report is coming out July 22nd of this month. Now, if that sounds familiar, it's because that report is the notorious report that ranked New Mexico 50th among all states for child well-being last year. We're hoping, of course, that we'll see some changes this year and in the future. Joining me to talk about that now, we have Dr. Veronica Garcia, the Executive Director of New Mexico Voices for Children. Thank you for being here. Good morning.
Thank you.
And James Jimenez, the Director of Policy, Research and Advocacy Integration for Voices for Children.
Thank you.
Thank you. So, Veronica, looking ahead to this report that's coming out on July 22nd, do we know what we can expect to see at this point?
We don't. I mean, we know we can't go any further down because we were 50th. We could stay the same. We could get better. But, you know, what I've said is, I don't want us to be playing hopscotch with Mississippi or to be, you know, languishing in the bottom 10 states. I think we have to set expectations high for our children. And that's what we will continue to push at Voices for Children, regardless of the rankings, because it's doubtful that, you know, if we do move up, that it would be very many
Huge,
steps,
yeah.
right? And so overall, we just have to keep our focus on raising the expectations and outcomes for our children.
So you guys, of course, are tracking the improvements made here in New Mexico,
Yes.
not just compared to other states. James, you work a lot on the policies that are crafted to do that, to make these improvements. Is that right?
That's exactly right. Nicole, what happened last year after the announcement of the 50th ranking was basically nothing. It was really rather surprising in that there wasn't more from our elected officials about how unacceptable this is that New Mexico's children should be ranked 50th. In the wake of that, Dr. Garcia had the staff start thinking real critically about, well, what are the things that we can recommend to our elected officials and to the community at large that would improve child well-being in New Mexico? And thus we came up with a policy agenda that makes some very specific recommendations in the 4 domain areas that Kids Count ranks us on.
And that is education, economics, health, family, and community, I believe.
Exactly.
Yes.
That's excellent.
Well, and those are the important ones, absolutely,
They are,
that make a difference.
And there are, you know, a whole series of policy recommendations under each domain. It would be impractical to adopt all of them. But what we wanted is, there are things that can be done. We don't have to just wring our hands and say, oh my God, we're 50th, this is so overwhelming. There are discrete policies that address each one. And what we hope is that our partners and other advocates and legislators will look and find something that resonates with them, that they believe they can push and make a difference. We have our priorities for our organization as well. We obviously aren't going to push for all 70 recommendations.
Well, we're going to talk more about the specifics this weekend on Eye on New Mexico. You can catch our full interview on Sunday morning at 10 a.m. Dr. Garcia and James Jimenez, thank you both for being here this morning.
Thank you, Nicole.
Kim, back to you. Good morning, and thank you for joining us for Eye on New Mexico. This year's Kids Count report is due out later this month on July 22nd, and that report might sound familiar to you because it was last year when New Mexico fell to 50th in the nation for child well-being in this report. We, of course, all share some responsibility for improving the lives of kids here in this state, and that's why I've tried to use this program recently to look at some of the solutions and the people trying to make things better. Joining me today, Dr. Veronica Garcia, the Executive Director of New Mexico Voices for Children. Thank you for being here.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Yes, you've been on the show before, and so we love to have you back. And James Jimenez, Director of Policy Research and Advocacy Integration for New Mexico Voices for Children. Welcome, James.
Thank you, Nicole.
Thank you for being here. I want to start, we'll get to that report that's coming out later this month in a moment, but I want to mention there was a conference held this week, New Mexico's second annual Kids Count Conference here. But Dr. Garcia, start us off by telling us, what is New Mexico Voices for Children, for those who aren't aware?
Sure. New Mexico Voices for Children has been around for 27 years. It was started by a group of pediatricians back then concerned about child well-being in New Mexico. We focus on evidence-based, research-based policy and advocate for those policies, primarily in the in the areas of education and health. And we also do a lot of fiscal analysis and tax policy analysis, because if we don't have the revenues there to pay for the programs, then we have a real problem. So those are the three main areas that we work in, but we do address child well-being in general as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And this Kids Count report, we hear about this once a year. The Annie E. Casey Foundation puts this out. What is that organization?
Well, the Annie E. Casey Foundation works in various areas, but this particular program, it's one program of the foundation, is to address child well-being nationally. And they, through research, have selected 16 indicators under 4 domains, education, health, economic well-being, and family and community, to address predictors of how, what needs to be in place for children to do well and to thrive in our country. And then they rank the 50 states. And so New Mexico Kids Voices for Children is the Kids Count anchor for the state of New Mexico. And
you guys put together the research then that the Casey Foundation is relying on to put together that report? We provide some, but they provide also research to us. It's sort of a two-way street in that regard. And they work with all 50 states. Yeah, as well as Puerto Rico, is my understanding. So obviously it's a big news item, a big headline when you say New Mexico ranked 50th in the country for child well-being, and we were 49th the year before it in 2012. So not a huge change to 2013, except that you have to deal with the last place in the nation. When this report comes out this year, we probably won't see a huge jump, if any. Is that right? That's correct. I mean, we can't get any worse. Yeah. Ironically, there's not a whole lot of statistical difference between 48th, 49th, and 50th. So the silver lining is that 50th did get people's attention. But, our goal is not to play hopscotch with Mississippi, nor to stay in the top or the bottom 10 states. Sure. And so regardless of the ranking, I think that we need to continue to move forward and have high expectations for the outcomes that we want for our children. And Jason may want to talk about that as well in terms of our data book that we will be putting out in January, where we're tracking New Mexico. Yeah, absolutely, James. Let's talk about that, because what we're interested in is not necessarily that number, that nationwide ranking, but how New Mexico is doing compared to New Mexico year over year. Exactly. It is of interest to some degree to rank ourselves against other states, but what was really most important, what Veronica has really emphasized, is this question of, are we making progress in improving child well-being in New Mexico? So every year, right about the time the legislative session starts, we produce a data book that shows specifically in the areas of where we're being measured by the Annie E. Casey Foundation and the Kids Count report, whether or not we are making progress. We will see, as Veronica says, there's not a lot of statistical difference between 48th and 49th, but there are some real discrete things that we can do to significantly improve child well-being in New Mexico, and that was part of the emphasis of the Kids Count conference this week, was to talk about some specific solutions that can be argued not just maybe from a social equity perspective, but also from an economics perspective on how we can improve the economic climate in our state. Yeah, give us an idea. Let's talk about this conference that was held. Who came? I understand one of the keynote speakers was talking about early childhood education.
Yes.
So give us an idea of some of the ideas that were brought forth.
Well, we were very fortunate. We had 3 dynamic speakers, but we'll start with early childhood and Dr. Art Rolnick, who is at the Humphrey School of Public Policy, right, in Minnesota, and was with formerly the Federal Reserve in that state. And he's an economist, like James, and he really talked about the return on investment in early childhood, and he said conservatively, I think 18%, and he thought that was a conservative number. In Minnesota, they really took a public-private partnership, but I think his main focus was these early investments result in, less costs, less in terms of incarceration, remediation, but then you also have a productive workforce, who is paying taxes, buying goods and services. So I mean, overall, these investments in early learning and care result in economic development.
Right. One of the really astounding statistics for me was he indicated that they had tracked some of these individuals over a 20-year period.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask about, yeah.
And they found that there was about a 50% reduction in the incidence of crime from the individuals that had access to high-quality early childhood education. So the 18% is not just a sort of a vague number out there. That's real savings that governmental entities actually realize by making these preventative early interventions in the lives of young children who otherwise, the future for them might not look all that bright because of poverty and a variety of reasons.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll note, too, I looked at that report, and I believe Minnesota was 5 or 4 on the list, so doing very well in terms of child well-being on that Kids Count report compared to New Mexico, of course. Now, so we have this data that measures 20 years worth of evidence. Why is it so hard, do you think, then, to implement some of these changes and urge lawmakers to say, here's the focus, put all the money into early childhood versus later?
I think we've made a lot of progress with policymakers. I mean, I think when I was cabinet secretary and we worked with the legislature to pass the Pre-K Act, where we were in 2005 and where we are now, I think policymakers truly get it that early childhood is, and now even from birth, home visiting and that sort of thing is important. What is lacking is a political will to make bold investments to turn it around, because piecemeal we're losing generations of children. And in a minute I'll talk about Dennis Campa's presentation, and it's quite alarming. But I think the need is estimated at $400 million, and when we look at what's been invested, we're not even close to that, which is why we have championed passage of the constitutional amendment that would take a constitutional amendment to tap into the Land Grab Permanent Fund that would take a small percentage of the income earned to fund, and that would cover about $125 million. But it's going to take a bold investment, would you not agree, to really turn this trajectory around? Piecemeal investments.
Some money here and there,
we're losing children. And if we look at Dennis Campa's presentation, he presented the Race for Results report. It's available online. You can request it from Kids Count as well as
we'll
from our
post the
office.
link on our website as well after this program.
It talks about the changing demographic in the nation, and New Mexico is ahead of that. We're about 60-40, 60% minority majority and 40% white in our state. If you look at the 0 to 22 population, it jumps to 72%.
Wow.
What that tells us, if we, with the achievement gaps and health gaps and income gaps, that if we don't make some significant investments to turn that and close those gaps and turn it around so that we have high achieving students and students who graduate from high school and go on to post-secondary education, the economic future for our state is very dismal.
Well, and one of the big problems is that our political system tends to reward short-term solutions, and really what we're talking about is sustained long-term investment in children and families that's really going to make the difference for New Mexico. It can't be that we can increase funding for 1 year
Yeah.
and then stop that. It's got to be sustained over an extended period of time, and it's got to be a range, sort of a holistic approach that incorporates families into the solutions on what is appropriate for each type of family, because it's not necessarily the same for every ethnic group or every
Sure.
racial group or every cultural group.
And even geographically around
Sure.
the state.
Very, a lot of differences between our different areas. When we talk about early childhood, and you talked about some of the indicators that are pointed out in these reports, education, economics, family, health care, what do children at that young age need the most? Where could we start putting dollars? Is it daycare? Is it pre-K? Where do we put the money specifically to help those kids?
I think it's in those three things that you just said. You know, home visitation is critically important so that parents are coached in terms of how to interact with their babies, to build. I mean, literacy starts getting built
Sure,
from
right
day
from the
one.
beginning.
You know, there's just a new report that came out, just reading to your babies, regardless if it was a newspaper or whatever, just builds
Yeah.
vocabulary, right? But it's also the other issues of minimizing adverse childhood experiences that affects brain development. So if the mother is suffering from postpartum depression, there's domestic violence in the home, or alcohol abuse, being able to get the mother connected or the father with social services and the appropriate interventions and supports around the family will minimize those adverse childhood experiences that affect brain development. So right from the get-go, home visitation is important. Then, of course, quality child care, and we call it quality child care and education, because it's more than just babysitting. That time, you know, there's a tremendous brain development. 80% of brain development happens before age 5. So, you know, those, 2-year-olds, 3-year-olds that are in typically daycare centers or at home need that stimulation, that cognitive development, also executive functions, learning how to take turns, impulse control, all of those things that are important, and then of course pre-K. And that's why I'm saying that this piecemeal funding is not hitting it. We know the infrastructure is there, the accountability systems are in place, and now it's just time to fund it and build the workforce as well, because investing in these programs also creates jobs.
Yeah. James, you mentioned the data book that comes out for the legislative session every year. This is part of starting to implement these changes. Is that right?
That's exactly right. And if I could just add one thing to what Veronica was saying, there's some really fascinating research that's being done by scientists that is tracking brain growth over time. And they've actually measured the size of children's brains over a period of time for those children who get high-quality pre-K services and those that don't. And the size of the brain is actually larger. It's really compelling studies that indicates that we're talking not about just short-term solutions. When we make these kinds of interventions and follow up with them, they have long-term, really important cognitive impacts for children. So through our data book, what we do then is try and show legislators, here's the specific solutions that you can implement to
Make
do the
laws
very
on,
things that we're talking about here, and how we make these investments in a wise way. As Veronica says, we do evidence-based research, and so we're not just pulling things out of the air. We want to recommend to legislators, because both Veronica and I have worked closely with legislators in the past and know how difficult their job is, and they need to have evidence-based solutions so that they can feel comfortable telling their constituents that we're investing in this program because we know it works elsewhere and we know it can work in New Mexico.
Yeah, well, we're going to take a quick break, but stay right here. We'll be back in about 2 minutes talking more with Dr. Veronica Garcia and James Jimenez. Stay with us. Welcome back, and thanks for staying with us. We are talking to Dr. Veronica Garcia and James Jimenez with New Mexico Voices for Children. As I mentioned in the first segment, the 2014 Kids Count report will come out on July 22nd. This is the report that had New Mexico 50th in the nation for child well-being last year. But today we're not just focusing on that number and where New Mexico ranks, but the changes that are being made right here in New Mexico, if New Mexico is improving year to year, and of course the things that we can do, the things we can all do in hopes of making these improvements, even small improvements year to year. Now, I wanted to point out, you guys have this policy agenda. We've been talking about a policy agenda for a better New Mexico that you put out every year. This is the 2014 copy that you can find on their website, and we'll post a link on our website. And you're looking, Veronica, you mentioned that you're looking at if policies being put into place in New Mexico are making changes every year, are leading to changes.
What the organization did and the policy team that James leads is to look at each of the indicators and the policy recommendations that we made and track legislation, or what we say policy progress. So your viewers, if they download this, they'll be able to see, yes, we made some progress in some areas, some we made no progress, others we did worse than we wanted. So yes, so we'll continue to track this, and so this is a wonderful start. We continue to refine this as we go, and so if viewers have ideas of maybe something we missed, a policy recommendation that they would make, please feel free to email us. Our email addresses are on the website.
Absolutely. And then as you track these policies, James, I imagine this helps you and helps legislators see, okay, did this law we passed, this policy we put in place, or this money we diverted last year, did it make a difference then,
That's
years
exactly
later?
Right. You know, one of the ones I'd like to highlight is something that's called in New Mexico the Work and Families Tax Credit. And it's based upon the federal earned income tax credit, which individuals that are working can earn back. So it's a way of reducing their income taxes. And it really is important because a full 26% of New Mexicans qualify for the earned income tax credit. And by building on that with New Mexico's version of the earned income tax credit, we can actually return millions of dollars back into the hands of families then that can use that money for everything from child care to health care to whatever the family's priorities are at that point in time. And it's really an important way of trying to balance out our tax system.
Yeah, that's a great one to highlight there, how you can use that tax policy to then help families with young children. We talked a little bit about this conference that was held this past week in Albuquerque, the Kids Count Conference, the second one that you guys have helped put on, and brought out a lot of great speakers talking about some of the ideas for change. One of the speakers you mentioned, I know you wanted to talk about, was Dolores Huerta.
Yes.
Tell us who she is. Yeah.
Well, Dolores Huerta was Cesar Chavez's right-hand woman, and was very active in negotiating the contracts. She's been a civil rights leader, human rights activist, and it's amazing. She's 84 years old and just as spry and spunky. You just wouldn't believe her age. And she received the Medal of Freedom Award, which is the highest civilian award. We showed a little clip where President Obama gave her her medal, and he said, Ms. Huerta, I must admit I stole Yes We Can from you, because it's a translation of Si Se Puede. Her response was, yes you did. But she really we had about, as I said, 350 people there, and she just had us all at the edge of our seat and really inspired us all that you know, by taking that extra step, and it was a really interesting exercise. She had us raise our hand. How many of you voted in the last election? Right? And people raised their hand. She said, how many of you got people out to vote? Well, then there were, what, maybe 25%? And, you know, she said, for our democracy to work, people need to get out and vote. And she mentioned a really interesting thing that I hadn't thought about, but she said culturally, in the Hispanic culture, she says people need to be asked to participate. You know, it's like, don't go stick your nose where it doesn't belong. She says they have to be invited to participate. And it was really interesting. And you know, when we look at election turnout, do you remember what the last turnout was?
25% or so for the primary.
You know, and when you think of this precious right that we have, that we don't exercise, right, to be able to vote, it's really quite disheartening. And if people are not happy with, you know, our conditions, then people need to express that, and we can make changes by going out to vote. And so that was very inspirational. That was the key message that I received from that. And where there's a will, there's a way, you know, and that passion to make a difference. And
recruiting others in the community, as she pointed out, how many of you asked others or got others to go vote.
Right.
So that's a great point, and one that we've been making, which is that everyone has to get involved with making this state a better place for kids. Is that right?
Well, that's exactly right. And what we found, I worked directly for the legislature for 5 years, and again, I appreciate the very difficult job that they have to do, but legislators are responsive to constituents, and when constituents tell them that something is important, you know, they have to make choices. They can either ignore their constituents and bear the consequences, or if it's a recommendation that they can also agree with and support, then they can help institute the kind of change that happens. But in the absence of feedback from their constituents, legislators are left with you know, a lack of reflection on the issues and an inability to really craft policies that they know are really important to the people that they're representing.
Yeah, as you point out that New Mexico is a diverse population in different areas of the state too. So these legislators are coming from some very unique communities and that may have different needs than their co-legislators.
Right, and I think, you know, we have a responsibility to show legislators, and we do break down data by, you know, counties and so on, so that they can see how we do that in the state data book, so that they can see how their communities are faring in these various indicators and what kind of progress their communities are making. And we hope that that will also spur them to action. The other thing that I found very heartening about the conference was such a diverse group of people that attended. There were some legislators, but there were higher ed people, people from the healthcare, from social work, from the medical community, educators. There were you know, community activists, just a whole hodgepodge of child care providers, of people there. But everyone focused on child well-being. If we could harness the energy of that, of those, just those people in that room, we could make a huge difference in child well-being in our state. I'm convinced.
Yeah.
One of the things that really excited me about it was diversity in different contexts, and that was the age diversity
that's
there.
true, yes.
There was, you know, obviously a lot of people our age, right, the older demographic, but then there was a really significant number of young people in the audience, you know, from 20s to 30s, people who are really at a really important start of their career, who are really engaged in learning about these issues and learning about what activism and advocacy means, and that's really important for being able to carry on in a sustained way the kinds of policy changes that we need.
Yeah, and hopefully, I know you guys invited a lot of candidates for office here in New Mexico and a lot of current office holders. Were they there and taking advantage and paying attention?
We had a candidate forum. We invited gubernatorial candidates, AG, treasurer, and auditor. We had all the Democrats attended. Two of the Republicans did attend, one running for AG and the other for treasurer. And it was unfortunate that we didn't get the other two there. I was disappointed about that, but we still had an interesting forum. Chris Schuler moderated the forum, and it was quite successful. And you know, to James' point about the young people, somebody said they really saw some of the young ones just taking notes and who was that. And part of the conference, we also do the Amy Beal Spirit of Youth Awards, and those awards go to young people who have really contributed to their community. And there was a young woman, and I'd have to dig in here, I don't remember her name, but she aged out of the foster care system and actually testified with Bill Jordan, one of our policy advisor and governmental relations director. She testified with him on, what was it, free tuition and fees for children who age out of the foster care system. So she herself was advocating for herself, and she was recognized.
Nice.
Yeah, I mean, when you talk about vulnerable children in New Mexico, there's probably no more vulnerable children in New Mexico than kids that, through no fault of their own, are in the foster system. And it's, you know, really breaks your heart to when you find out that, you know, there's a point where these kids age out of the foster system and the support basically stops for them, right? And they're left on their own. And the opportunity for them to have tuition waived is hugely important for these kids, to give them that next opportunity to, you know, to build their lives from you know, the difficult things that they've experienced.
Absolutely.
And the youngest honoree was 13 years old, and she was doing amazing little things for her community. So, you know, already to be thinking of how can you improve your community and what you can do you know, to get out of your own comfort zone, whether it's to go cook a meal at the Ronald McDonald House or organize a fundraising drive. You know, it's just amazing to see young people doing that.
At that age, that is impressive and hopefully inspiring to those of us much older and that have even more resources and means to give back a little bit, to volunteer, whatever we can do. Like you said, that small something, just going and volunteering at the Ronald McDonald House. As you add those up, it makes a difference. Now, of course, the legislative session is a ways away still, but is there any key thing you guys will be looking at as you put together your data book or policy recommendations for this year?
I'll talk about a couple of tax items, and then Veronica can talk about
and we only have about a minute and a half left, unfortunately.
Right.
But yeah.
Well, a couple of them. One would be an expansion of what we call the Working Families Tax Credit, which again returns money back into the hands of families that they can use to help support things like child care services. The other one would be what we call as a tax expenditure budget, which really provides for a much higher level of accountability for the tax breaks that are being offered for businesses to make sure that we're really getting the benefit for everybody.
Excellent.
Expand funding for pre-K, for home visitation, for child care, quality. Again, the constitutional amendment, we hope that we will be able to get it through the legislature and let New Mexicans decide. It's a ballot initiative. Because I think...
And this is diverting some of that money from the...
some of the interest that is earned, yes. And also in terms of child care, going down to 200% of poverty so that the working poor can benefit, because oftentimes when they start making a little money, they no longer qualify.
Right.
And it's just a catch-22. It's this cliff effect keeping them in this cycle of poverty.
All right. Well, we'll be watching for that report coming out on July 22nd, New Mexico's annual Kids Count ranking. And we'll see you back here next weekend for another Eye on New Mexico. Thank you guys for being here.
Thank you, Nicole.